Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Emily Burt.
And I'm Dami Adewale. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. Today we'll be reflecting on the shrinking space occupied by Black-led charities and asking what has changed for these organisations since the momentum that gripped the sector in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's murder in 2020.
Our guest today is Danielle Bridge. Danielle is the Chief Executive of Black Minds Matter UK, a charity founded during the COVID-19 pandemic that, until recently, provided therapy services to support the mental health of Black people. Hi, Danielle.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So to start, could you just walk us through Black Minds Matter UK's story, from the circumstances that surrounded its founding to the organisation's situation today?
Awesome. So BMM was founded as a GoFundMe campaign in 2020. And I, like everybody else, saw its birth online and was fascinated by this offer. It was something that has been needed previously and still needed after, to be able to match Black people to Black therapists to unpack and process the trauma that a lot of Black people were living through at that time, both off the back of COVID, but also off the back of the murder of George Floyd. And I saw it on social media and was like, I need to get involved. So there was a trustee position. I went for the trustee position and I got in as a trustee for about 8 weeks. I think the reason why I was a trustee for about 8 weeks, my background is in founding and running a social enterprise, ABC Life Support, which I founded in 2010. So I found myself with a little bit more time and thought I could offer something in this role. It became quite apparent quite quickly that because of the scale of growth and because of the demand that happened so quickly, that there was an awful lot of infrastructure that was needed to be built from the ground up. So I took over the role as interim chief executive in January 2023 and have been there in post ever since.
Just going back to 2020 then and looking at the whole situation there, what did George Floyd's murder and the sector momentum that kind of gathered around the Black Lives Matter movement in its aftermath mean for Black-led voluntary organisations?
Great question. And to be honest with you, I have no idea what that meant at that time. I do know as a Black woman who saw that explosion of interest in the lives of Black individuals that had been highlighted to a position I'd never seen before. And the fact that there was so much interest in our plight, I guess. And as I mentioned before, this is not the first time that these kinds of experiences had manifested themselves in the public, but it was the first time that all eyes were on it. And at that time in 2020, there were so many people that were watching his murder. There were so many people that were watching the disparities in healthcare. There were so many people who were watching Black people disproportionately being affected by COVID. There was all of these challenges. And so I watched it as a Black person and felt the pain of every single one of my brothers and sisters. And it was really difficult to see. What came after that, I think, was really fascinating, because then money came about. So much money was invested into finding solutions or equitable solutions for the difficulties that we had in our community. And I'd never seen anything like that before. And I don't think I'll ever see anything like that again. And when I say that, I mean the investment from organisations, corporate organisations, statutory funding. They found money and it was like, right, we really need to get behind these movements. We really need to get behind these solutions. Let's just give cash. And so as a result of that, Black Minds Matter UK within the first 6 months, I think, raised about £1.5 million. I mean, it's unheard of. That came with some challenges because, as you could imagine, normally you find a passion, you find a gap and you grow slowly. You deliver what you can based upon the monies that you've got. Whereas this was a back to front organisation. So there was suddenly millions of pounds in the bank and lots and lots and lots of people to deliver the service to. But how do you create sustainability off of that jump point?
It was such a fascinating time. I was in my first year of being the editor when this happened. And I think it was a real kind of explosion point that brought a lot of things together in the sector. And there was kind of a collective, almost an awakening to the structural racism that existed in the charity sector at the time. And there was also, by dint of everyone being at home, everyone was online, everyone was watching this. And I think the response in many ways played out online as well, because people could not go onto the streets to protest. They could not get out and congregate and find other solutions. So there was, I think, a real desire to, as you say, provide those solutions in a really quick way. And there was also a lot of collective white guilt. And it was very interesting watching this manifest, because first you had organizations coming out and posting their hashtag Black Lives Matter hashtags and posting their black squares. And once people said, well, this is not actually anything, we actually need you to do something tangible, I think the place people went to immediately was money, because we cannot provide any physical fix for this. But there was a desire, I think, to prove, well, we are not racist. We are organizations that strive to be anti-racist, and we're proving this by providing funding. And there were a number, I think, of Black-led organizations at that time that suddenly benefited from huge amounts of income that they'd never had before. And that was a real game changer for these organizations, but many of them did not have the structures in place to actually manage these kinds of funds. And I think it is super interesting, in particular, that, as you say, Black Minds Matter UK began as a crowdfunder, because that's not just corporate, although I imagine you did have a large number of corporate donations coming in. There's also individual action feeding into that as well. How did Black Minds Matter UK then build as much as it could sort of infrastructure around this very large sum of money that you then found yourself sitting on?
Yeah, great question. And I think that was part of the problem, because when you have such a huge amount of income, the expectation is to deliver on the same scale, rather than actually take a step back and think, okay, well, we've got this money. How can we make it last? How can we provide the service? How can we think about sustainability? How can we think about impact? Rather than actually, let's just deliver what everybody was expecting us to deliver, which was free talking therapy for the Black community. That's expensive. Direct service delivery is an expensive output for any charity. But while we're doing that piece of work, you're also trying to navigate and understand what statutory talking therapies looks like. What are the business models that are available? And doing all of this stuff in the background with very small resources in terms of people on the ground, doing that work, whilst also delivering, whilst also managing the expectations of this huge community that gave their pounds to this cause, was a really difficult tension to kind of balance. And to your point, the founders, massive respect to Annie and Agnes, who founded this GoFundMe campaign. I think taking it from that campaign into a fully fledged charitable organisation is a much bigger ask than that. And some would argue that actually that money that came in, if you think about kind of mission, finishing your mission, right, we've got all of this money, let's deliver as much therapy as we can, and then we close it as a GoFundMe. It didn't. And I think that there was an appetite from community as well, and our community and the sector. Well, this is sustainability, right? All you've got to do is just fundraise more and just deliver more, without taking into consideration that it's what I call, and it is me, so I'll take full responsibility for this, it's a movement charity. It was at a moment in time, there was a cause at the time, and even looking back at those people who donated, we had some serious challenges. Like there was a problem with the transference of data, for example, because there wasn't a charity at that time. A trust held our money. So getting the money from the trust was brilliant, and they transferred that money. But what it meant was they had a tiny little box that said, we will never give your details to any third party. BMMUK was the third party, which meant that when they transferred over the money, we didn't get any of the data about who they were, where they came from, what motivated them. And if you understand the charity sector, an awful lot of follow-up and around stewarding for fundraising is a massive part of the work. If you don't have that information to start with, then you're kind of on the back foot, even trying to steward those original donors. So that was a massive challenge. And I think that did make a big difference. But I don't think it made a difference to the point of what we're recognising now.
And what is the picture for your organisation now?
Very different from what it was. And we're in a period of transition. And I think that transition can be very scary for people, because if you're not doing what you originally set out to do, then what are you doing? So there's a lot of expectation, like I said, from the sector, but also expectation from those donors, expectations from service providers and service users. So what that means is, and I've said it from the very beginning, my first day here, this service model, business model is not sustainable. because you're going to have to repeat the income of 1.5 million time and time again outside of the time that created that level of income in the first place. And we've seen the interest in Black Lives Matter change, so much so that the political landscape now is literally telling us that our cause is no longer on the top of people's agendas. And so as a result of that, the income is not coming in. We are sitting on reserves, which mean that we have to make very bold strategic decisions about the future of BMMUK. And we're in it right now. I mean, like literally having the conversations, speaking to the community, finding out about what other viable business models exist, what people would want from us, what the expectations are now, all of that. So we're asking all of the right questions right now. That's a bit of a problem, because when you're asking lots of questions and you're delivering lots of services, then people are like, oh, well, you're not delivering on what it is you said you was going to deliver. But as you know, charities have to find a very fine balance between 100% transparency from a business point of view, reputational risk. It makes a massive difference, the Charity Commission, on all of these sorts of things. So there's a lot of expectation on us. And I think at the moment we are taking our time to understand who we are and how we can create sustainability now and into the future. And I think that that is the pivotal moment that we're in, because it matters. And if we don't do that work now, we will not be here in another 2 years to make any impact whatsoever.
You mentioned speaking with communities. I'm sure you've had lots of conversations with Black-led organisations and organisations that support Black people. But just looking more widely, do you see the situation at BMM as being reflective of the general situation facing Black-led organisations or charities that exist primarily to support Black people?
So I think it's really important to recognise that we're in a really strange situation right now for charities across the UK. Charities are struggling. Donor numbers are down, interests are waning. We're being asked an awful lot by an awful lot of charities to donate. Cost of living crisis, coming out of austerity, all of these things have a massive impact. And so I think it's really important just to be clear on that, first of all. In terms of Black-led or, marginalised, or what we would call niche charities, of course, we're going to have, because there's an intersection there, isn't there? There's the same as the other charities, but we've also got these other things that compound those challenges. And so I can't physically speak for all of the Black-led charities in the UK, but what I can say is, after speaking to my peers in our sector, this is the direction of travel. The money's not there, the interest isn't there. People used to be talking about being anti-racist. Now we've got situations in the press and, in the arena, the public arena, I guess, that are kind of speaking in the complete opposite of that. And we know it, and it's blatant and it's true and it's in your face. So we can't really hide from it. We are absolutely impacted by that. And because of funding, because of what I think is a lack of trust in Black-led organisations in terms of, is the governance there? Is the infrastructure there? Do we trust these organisations to do what they say they were going to do? Which I believe stems from institutional racism. We're having to answer those questions at the same time.
I think there is a changing environment. As you say, there is definitely a funding scarcity. There's a scarcity mindset, particularly for Black-led organisations at the moment. I was talking to one charity chief a month ago who was saying, the trouble is you have these racial justice pots of money. So these pots are getting smaller because of that changing appetite that you described. And so then you have all of these Black-led organisations who are competing for this small pot of money, which is then, by and large, a lot of these are tied to very specific requirements as well, quite burdensome application processes, having to do very intense impact reporting because of that lack of trust and that unwillingness to just fund core organisational costs rather than project-based opportunities, which will allow a charity to keep moving for as long as that pot of funding lasts, but it's not going to help on that longer-term sustainability piece, which is why it makes complete sense that you're taking time to ask these big conversations. And I'm right, you have currently paused your therapy services,
That's
haven't
correct.
you?
Yes.
What was that decision like with the trustee boards? When did you take that decision?
Really hard. So as chief executive there, I've seen this drop off coming. You can see it. You can see that the income isn't coming in, and you can, forecast and say, okay, well, the end game, I guess, is April 27. Let's pick a date. And so before a certain moment in time, if things don't turn around substantially, we need to start thinking about winding up. And what I find fascinating about the wind up conversation is people are often very scared of closure. For them, it means that they think that they've failed in some way, shape or form, rather than actually sometimes things need to come to a natural end. Now, the irony is I'm not talking about the natural end for BMMUK, right? I'm talking about taking a moment in time and making really bold, difficult decisions that kept me up at night, that made me think about my failure. Have I failed in not being able to turn it around? What does it mean for my community? Have our community backed us? All of these questions that kept coming up for me. And in the end, we needed to pause the service. Now, I also need to make it quite clear at this point that pausing the service isn't a new thing, because when we first came in, it was like, right, we've got 500 people on the waiting list. Let's turn off the tap. Let's push through the wait list, and then we'll open up the tap again to any new applications. So that model was used prior. But what we wanted to do this time was to close it and pause it, and then take the time to think and consult with the community. So that was the decision that was made in October. The board were fully behind it at the time. They understood the necessity to do that. It was a bit scary because it was like, we've done this before. But I'm also one of those people that's like, guys, your feelings and emotions are very valid and I understand, but they can sometimes stop you from making decisions that need to be made. And so as difficult as those decisions are and were at the time, I was very clear with my team about being as honest as I could be, in that I do not know what's going to happen. I have no idea, but these are the steps that we're going to make to try and work out what those options are. And so that's where we paused. So we closed the service in January of this year, and we went into consultation with the community. And what that meant was everybody on the waiting list was communicated with. We explained to them the situation. We explained to them the fact that we have to create, sustainability for the charity. We understand how difficult it is, especially for the Black community, to have reached out in the first place, because that was quite a big problem for us. People who reach out for mental health support, they are struggling potentially, and to make that first call and then to get into our service only to be told, I'm sorry guys, we can't put you through that service, must have been an absolutely devastating blow for a lot of them. And I do take that reality on board, but you have to balance what you're dealing with at that time versus sustainability for the future. And I don't mean the future couple of months or years, I mean into the future as a sustainable charity for years and generations to come. And I was that honest with our community. And I think that the majority of them did understand, but you can still hold two truths at once, right? There's that, yes, I understand, but yes, I'm very disappointed. And I carry that with me.
I think it's also very important to flag that I'm sure Black Minds Matter UK is far from alone in this situation. In fact, we know that Black Minds Matter UK is far from alone in this situation, because we have organisations of all sizes at the moment that are having to pause services or actually just end services altogether. We have organisations that are having to make reductions in their headcounts. We've got funders who are going on pause because they are so oversubscribed in terms of demand from charities that they're having to completely rethink the ways that they allocate money out into the sector. It is a very challenging environment right now, and I think it's a very brave thing to actually say we need to take a bit of time to reflect and try to think about what is the best way forward for our organisation, because that pressure when you are in a charity is to keep delivering and to keep serving your community. And it, I think, is quite a compelling pressure on people. But if you give in to that, then the risk is that you deliver services that are not sustainable or services that are less good than they should be, and ultimately don't end up serving that community.
So another challenge that is often run into in the sector is that organizational growth is often prioritized over impact. So I wanted to speak from a BMM perspective. How have you seen this manifest, and why is that problematic?
Yes, the growth conundrum. Impact equals more people, equals shinier reports, equals more reporting for funders, all of these things that growth demands. And it's really hard these days, I think, especially with the medium of social media. You've got to be seen to be shiny and on the ball and culturally relevant. And I say it's, that sexy marketing to be able to prove impact. That in and of itself costs money. And when you're spending money on marketing, your vision and your mission versus the actual delivery under the ground, which isn't as sexy, especially when we're talking about mental health, it's really difficult to try and have that balance between the two. So impact wise, it's really, really, really hard to be able to prove that what you're doing has impact outside of the growth mentality. So if we can say, oh, we've served over 20,000 people are like, oh my God, that's amazing. If I said we served 10 people really well, and that the impact that we delivered for those 10 people meant that the ripple effect created by the therapy that they were given, for example, meant that there were hundreds of people in their immediate family, friends, work environment were impacted with that. How do you turn that and make that sexy? So I think the numbers, that number game, go big or go home kind of mentality is the thing that can sometimes catch us unawares, I guess. And it's really hard to try and balance the demand of what that looks like from those people that do scroll through their phones and look at this charity and go, oh my God, it's amazing. It's such a strong brand. Versus we've got a mother whose 23-year-old is struggling with an eating disorder. He is extremely heavy. He cannot get out of bed. She's desperate for help and support. And we can provide that support. How do we balance those? And how do we do that without exploiting her story for the benefit of that perceived growth and success? That's a really tough thing to balance, and we're trying.
Before you were at Black Minds Matter UK, you were the chief of a CIC. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how you see other kind of for good models, such as CICs and CIOs, faring in this space compared to charities.
From my point of view, running a CIC for as long as I did, and understanding that actually when I made the decision to found that organisation, it was off of the back of a business model which meant that there was automatic sustainability because it was born from first aid training. Now, first aid training sits under the health and safety executive requirement for any organisation with more than 5 people. So unless that changes significantly in the future, organisations are always going to have first aid training. So you've already got the demand there. And the reason I set it up as a CIC was because of a lived experience model for me personally that involves my family, both my parents. And it was all about creating opportunities for people to get access to life-saving treatment for their children primarily. That's how it was founded. When they didn't necessarily have enough money, or they wasn't in a workplace, it wasn't part of an offer that their organisation gave them. It was purely because they had children. And if your child chokes, how on earth do you deal with choking? That shouldn't be knowledge that you garner just because you're in a work environment. You were forced to go on a health and safety course, right? So that was how the business was founded. But what I realised very quickly was that the model was sustainable because I could charge people. So immediately we charged. And not only did we charge, but we charged a little bit more than most organisations charged, because off of the back of that income, we provided the first aid training for those people that didn't have to access it through that means. So we built up relationships with Sure Start children's centres at the time. They're now turned into family centres. So we got contracts with councils, and we worked with Bernardo's and One YMCA to deliver first aid training to the parents that use those facilities. But all of that money came from corporate organisations who had no choice but to pay it because it was a statutory requirement. So when I think about my thought processes around that, it wasn't anything more than, well, that makes sense. They've got to pay for it, so why not pay for it, and we'll do some really good stuff with that money that comes out of it. And I was very comfortable, and the fact that the business is still running after 16 years is testament to that fact. When I came over to a charity, I was like, where's the stuff? What do I sell? There was that lack of entrepreneurial agility, I guess, that I found quite difficult. So it was then more like going cap in hand to people saying, can I have some money, please? Because we want to do some really good stuff, but we can't do it without you. And there was no way to think about that CIC model. So for me, the charity sector is almost on the back foot because of the way it's set up. You have no choice, or And don't get me wrong, I know that there are charitable arms and tradable arms within organisations. That's absolutely fine. But to your point earlier, the funding landscape is so oversubscribed because people find it easier to go fill out a grant application, get their money, deliver a project, deliver the impact, and off you go. And what I found fascinating, I sat on the advisory board of an impact hub, and that was a mental wellbeing accelerator program for founding businesses. And I was watching all of them pitch, and all of them were pitching these ideas about their businesses. They were amazing businesses. And again, often in this sector, they're born out of a passion or a gap that you see in the market. And I sat there watching all of them, and all of them were saying they were getting their funding from grants and councils and stuff like that. And I was like, they sound like charities. And so afterwards, everyone was clapping. And I was like, wow, that's great. And I, being me, was like, so what's your tradable income? And they're like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, what's your tradable income? As a CIC, the CIC regulator states that you have to have a minimum of 50% of your income via trade. So what are you trading? They're like, oh, we haven't thought about that yet. And I was like, ah. And then that made me think that the sector is very, very, very oversubscribed now, because not only do they have charities that are asking for money, but they've also got CICs that are asking for money. And I don't know whether or not that's a regulatory issue, i.e. is there enough follow-up being done by the CIC regulators to make sure that these things are being done? You have to fill in your CIC 34 form at the end of every year with your accounts. But is there any checkup? Is there any differentiator between the two? Because now you've got double the amount of businesses going for grant and trust fundraising, whereas before it was ring-fenced to just charities. So I think that might be a bit of a challenge.
You've spoken previously about the difficulties you've had in maintaining sustainability with obviously your fluctuating income levels. But how can organizations ensure their sustainability when your very existence is questioned? I mean, how is this challenge manifesting for Black-led organizations?
Oh, there's the question. If I knew the answer to that question. Do you know what? I think this is really tough, because there is an element of me that, and it is me, I spoke to my board about it and they are very aware of my feelings, but when you are with and for led in terms of communities, whichever community to which you belong to, there has to be a level of responsibility that is felt by those that exist in that community. And so what I mean by that is, back in 2020, an awful lot of corporate organisations, lots of white guilt, to your point, was feeding into this. And it almost compounds this narrative that Black people need charity. You know, we can't do things by ourselves. We need to have handouts all the time. There's government handout, feeds into that whole social care system and all this kind of stuff. And yes, of course, but that exists throughout society, full stop. But there is also the opposite that exists in those arenas. And that is that there are people who want to give. There are people who are passionate about our causes, and maybe they don't know about it. Maybe they don't know how to help. Maybe they haven't heard about it. Or on the opposite side, maybe they're the people that everybody goes to because they are the affluent people within those communities. And therefore they are being asked to almost provide financial sustainability for all of us. And that can't exist. So for us, for example, there was a campaign that I started in October 2025 that was born around a very old and historic savings model, which is called a partner hand. So I'm from the Caribbean, and my grandparents came over in the Windrush. And back in those days, there was no access to bank accounts. There was no trust in them, and they couldn't open a bank account to save money. So what they did was to pool their resources together in what we call a hand, and everybody within the community would give their £10 a week, and then at the end of the month a family would draw down the entire amount, and that would continue for as long as that hand existed. That was an amazingly powerful collective tool to create wealth for people that didn't have access to it at the time. And I thought about that with my mum, actually. We had a conversation about it. I was like, do you remember Granddad? And he had a partner hand. And she said, yeah, I remember that. That's what we used to do. And people used to come around and bring food and drink, and they'd draw down their money and go away for the month. And I said, I think that that's a way that we can create our own income. And she said, well, go for it, see what happens. And so we launched it. Now, I want to go back to an earlier point in this conversation where I talked about marketing, because unlike the original GoFundMe campaign, which went viral because there was an appetite in a moment in time. This didn't. It didn't go viral. It didn't create this massive movement. It kind of just went, ugh. And I was devastated by that. I was like, oh man. But I learned something. I learned that movements like this are only created in pivotal moments of pain. And this is the complete opposite of that. This is looking at joy and collectivity and community and all of those beautiful things that makes me extremely proud to be a Black woman living in the UK. But it didn't quite reach what I needed it to reach. But that doesn't mean that the opportunity isn't there. It just means that when we're thinking about creating movement around movement, we have to be clever and we have to use the mediums to which it is that we've got available to us. So, when we're thinking about talking to corporates and corporates are going, how can we help you? Well, you're an advertising organisation, so let's have a conversation, rather than actually money, because money is not necessarily the thing that's going to help us get to where we need to get to. But organisations giving us resource and capacity might mean that campaign goes from an idea that sits in my head to a UK-wide movement of which every Black person in the UK can own something that belongs to them, to us, without having to go to those environments which cause pain and are difficult and do not look at us with trust. And so I don't think our job is done. I just think that we need to rethink the way in which we do things.
I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about how you are approaching leadership in this context, the kind of conversations that you are having with your board, the conversations you're having with your community as you understand from them what they want to see from Black Minds Matter UK going forward.
When you work in this work, it's really important that you use the passion that you have behind the cause, and often it is based upon a lived experience, and I'm no different. But you don't rely on just that passion. You rely on the fact that in order to do business, you have to know what you're doing and you have to know why you exist in the first place. So taking it back to the fund at the time, moment, what do we now need? We now need a service that has never existed for Black people. The NHS has never worked for Black people. The NHS doesn't work for the people, for everybody now, but it's a huge beast that's broken, does amazing work. My mum worked in the NHS as a mental health social worker for 25 years. It's done amazing things for a lot of families. It's not saying that the people within it are broken, but the overall system, is too big. It doesn't work very well. It's difficult to navigate. From that point of view, I think it's really important that we understand what exists, what doesn't work. Let's be brave and think about what we could do in this modern era with the influx of AI and responsibility around what community needs, and to take that understanding of everybody has mental health, but everybody experiences life differently. And so how can they feed into the services that we may provide in the future on their level? In terms of my leadership, I often think I'm quite independent. I'm an independent thinker. That's sometimes quite tough when you're working in a charity, because you have to take on the voices of an awful lot of other people, not just your own. But I think also my communication style is that I'm very open. So what it is I'm thinking, I would translate and communicate very easily and gain feedback. Even if it's the opposite to what I'm proposing, there is room for people's opinions, people's evidence, people's passion, people's lived experience, and taking all of that and moulding it into the future of BMMUK is something I find quite exciting.
What would your message or your advice be to peer organisations in the sector looking to support small minority-led counterparts?
First of all, partnership. I hear this word quite a lot. We'd love to work in partnership with you. And what we find sometimes is that partnership isn't a partnership. It's a demand for a service with no financial backing to see it through. And so when you're working with smaller organisations or niche organisations, Black-led organisations, be really clear in what that is. If it's a transaction, just be honest about it. Actually, we need this, and in exchange for this, we can provide this. Great. If it's, we'd love to be able to help and understand what it is that you need, but what does that look like? How much time, resource and energy and effort is it going to take to rehash our trauma or to come up with the same story again in order to get something, and what you're getting out of it? So I think it's really important to be clear in asking smaller organisations to do the work, means that it has to be funded. It has to be taken into consideration that there is often a very small resource team. We don't have the same budget in terms of headcount or capability that our larger counterparts do. So just approach with an open mind and ask more questions than you would give answers to, perhaps.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was an absolutely fascinating conversation, and we'll all look forward to seeing where Black Minds Matter UK ends up after you've finished this very important period of strategic thinking and reflection.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure chatting to you.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Danielle. And that's it for this week. From all of us at Third Sector, thank you for listening. Our producer is Jude Owen.